Canadians will be able to count on stable and predictable funding from a government led by Andrew Scheer. Both the CHT and the CST will continue to increase by at least 3% every year.
Conservative leader Andrew Scheer made a healthcare funding announcement today meant to preempt attacks from the Liberals. If elected, Scheer promised that the Canada Health transfer to provinces and territories would increase by at least 3% per year. That's the same deal the Liberals announced in 2017. But the Liberals also tied their funding escalator to the gross domestic product, meaning funding could increase above that 3% mark. The Trudeau government also promised $11.5 billion in funding for mental health care and home care. Scheer's announcement didn't stop the finance minister from firing back. Bill Morneau released a letter saying Scheer's plan left out mental health and home care funding, and that means cuts. In the letter, it says, in trying to provide certainty to provinces and territories, you have in fact created uncertainty. When Canadians hear political leaders say that they intend to maintain or increase funding, that is what they expect to see, not cuts to programs and services that Canadians rely on. Scheer slapped back on Twitter, saying, right on cue, Liberals are lying about my commitment. At least 3% means we will maintain the current funding formula. How's that balanced budget coming? Hashtag not as advertised. So was this announcement a win for the Conservatives? It is time for the Friday Power Panel in Calgary. Journalist Jen Gerson here with me in studio is Paul Wells and Shannon Proudfoot, both from Maclean's. I'll start with you, Jen. Andrew Scheer had a clear strategy today in laying out this announcement, trying to say the Liberals are going to accuse him of planning healthcare funding cuts, and he's trying to preempt that line of attack. Is that a smart strategy?
Yeah, it's a smart strategy, but I mean, there's a lot to unpack here when we're going to talk about healthcare funding and escalator funding. I mean, we can go back to 2004 and 2006 when under the Martin government, the federal government promised a 6% increase to healthcare funding per year. Harper came into power, continued that funding, and then said, well, that funding is going to expire in 2017, and then we're going to move to a 3% per year increase in funding. The Liberals continued that 3% and added some home care and some mental health services on top, which I presume gets us to 4.1%. So now you have the Liberals claiming that the sheer Conservatives are going to cut funding to 3%, which is the same thing that they promised to do, and is even though that they're only funding at 4%, which is about, which is technically a cut from 6%. So if anybody else is already hating this election, please put your hand up. And then the second thing I would say is that when people hear the word cut, what they're typically thinking is they're thinking of cuts to existing funding, cuts to existing services. They don't tend to associate the word cut with a reduction in funding or a reduction in future promised funding. So I mean, that's where I think we're starting to play semantics with some of these things.
Paul, to you, what do you think about Scheer's strategy in trying to get out ahead of any sort of potential Liberal rhetoric around Andrew Scheer trying to make deep cuts?
It's clearly a shield. Andrew Scheer doesn't want to necessarily win converts among Canadians who are hoping for a big new healthcare spending. He's just anticipating what is, frankly, an inevitable Liberal attack, which is that this Conservative will cut healthcare spending. And he's, before they ask the question, he's saying, no, I won't. Jen's right. It's hard to know who to get more frustrated at by these competing claims and counterclaims. The fact is, federal transfers to the provinces for healthcare have increased in every year since 1997. That's 22 consecutive years of increases in healthcare transfers under 2 Liberal governments and a decade of Stephen Harper. That's the longest uninterrupted period of increases in social transfers to the provinces in the history of social transfers to the provinces. Both sides are essentially trying to make up a problem where, for all intents and purposes, none exists. Where there is localized shortage in healthcare supply, there's actually no expert opinion to the effect that it's the fault of the federal government. It's difference in opinion on how to administer healthcare locally, and it's true that Stephen Harper continued to implement Paul Martin's healthcare plan, and Justin Trudeau faithfully implemented Stephen Harper's healthcare plan on the schedule that Stephen Harper chose. So for Conservatives and Liberals to trade accusations here is pretty bad faith, because they've actually essentially collaborated in a long period of increasing health transfers.
Shannon, today's announcement, when Andrew Scheer made it, it wasn't crystal clear to us here at CBC News. So one of our colleagues in the office, Olivia Stefanovich, reached out to Andrew Scheer's team to say, okay, you say this, the 3% mark, okay, but, are you actually keeping the plan that's in place right now? What is actually happening? And they said, they came back to us and said, yes, okay, they're going to keep the funding for the mental health care and for the home care, as well as they're going to keep the exec plan in place. Can an opposition party, is it good for an opposition party to campaign on, to hold a big event on something that the other guys adopted?
Yeah, there was sort of a strange defensive hokiness to the announcement today, right? You had this sort of like almost a giant novelty check with this fake contractual language and the logo and the big signature. And if we're trying to assess whether, Paul and Jen are right, that there's a certain kind of cheekiness in going back and forth on this, given that they both contributed to the same pattern. But if we're trying to assess whether a potential Liberal line of attack that Conservatives means cuts, linking it to Doug Ford, which we'll get to later, the fact that they felt compelled to do a news conference, to print up a giant novelty check about it, to adopt kind of a defensive stance, suggests it's a bit of a sore point, whatever the kind of reality of it is.
Jen, to you, what do you make of Andrew Scheer doing this, a big sort of announcement that he's trying to get a big splash on? He's in a position right now where he's trying to have Canadians get to know him, and that's one of the biggest challenges he has, or any opposition leader has. What do you make of him making this kind of announcement, trying to make a splash on the Friday of a holiday-long weekend?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Shannon entirely. This is obviously a defensive ploy. I mean, the timing, of course, isn't particularly great, but he's just trying to consistently reinforce through a drip-drip effect this idea that, he's not this scary extreme conservative. He's a pretty down-the-road type of conservative figure, and you can expect to see from him the same sort of stuff that we could expect to see potentially under Harper, and he's not a radical, is the position he's trying to get at. The timing of this announcement is obviously going to go over most people's heads. No one cares at this point. No one's paying attention. But if he can steadily do these types of small, comparatively small announcements over time, again and again and again, over weeks and weeks and weeks, there's almost an attrition effect, right? Like he's slowly going to, hopefully for him, break down the position that he's some kind of scary, terrifying Doug Ford-esque radical is I think the strategy here.
Paul, as you mentioned, for 22 years, there hasn't been a decrease in the funding of health transfers. If that's the case, why even go there on this issue?
Because the Liberals always go there, especially when things start to get a little scary for them. Stéphane Dion did in 2008. Michael Ignatieff did in 2011. When Liberals really want to scare you about Conservatives, they say they're going to cut health care. And it is true that Stephen Harper reduced the rate of growth, or said he would reduce the rate of growth in transfers. But, unfortunately, he wasn't around as Prime Minister to actually implement that policy, so Justin Trudeau implemented it for him. The 22-year actual track record of both parties is of consistently increasing healthcare transfers and of broadly agreeing on the rate of growth of healthcare transfers. So this is a phony war.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.